to really look at it deeply with great insight and be able to offer some suggestions and some advice, if we can call it that, to the decision makers and policy makers from the scholarship that resides within the FNVA and its contributors. A little word about the FNVA before I launch into the 5 webinars, or let me start with the 5 that we've done, just to recap for some people who have joined us for the first time. We started about a month ago, and the first one we did was on China's expansionist policies. This was chaired by Ambassador Vivek Karju, and it was a very good understanding that one got about Chinese expansionism, and not only in southwards towards areas which are now under the control of Pakistan, but also we delved into Xinjiang in a major way with 2 very, very good speakers, and then also looked at a Central Asian angle to it, which was provided by none other than a scholar like Professor Siddiq Wahid. Panel 2, we looked at Tibet today. We looked at the contemporary developments in Tibet, and there we had people like Professor Kondapalli gave the introductory remarks, and we had 3 excellent speakers, scholars, who actually gave us a very deep insight into what's happening in Tibet as of today. The third panel was on international support for the freedom of Tibet. Again, a very interesting insights that we got. It was chaired by a person who's on our panel today, and a very eminent personality in the jurist world. It was a professor, if I may call him, Michael Van Walt, and he was a panelist for Buchung Shering, and there was Kai Muller, Dolmala, also who contributed majorly into that. The fourth panel was on reaffirming the status of Tibet. It was chaired by Ambassador Kapil Sibal, and we had again the privilege of having Dr. Michael Van Walt there, Kelsang Gyaltsen, and Sering Topgyal. This is the fifth, and I think we've been very fortunate that some of the finest minds in the country who are looking at Tibet in a very deep sort of manner to be available to us and participate in the seminar. Let me welcome at the outset Gautam Bambawale, who is an ambassador, who was a former ambassador to Pakistan and China. I'm not going to go into their bios. I'll spend all the time doing that otherwise. But thank you, Gautam, for chairing this session. We are also very fortunate to have with us as a speaker General J.J. Singh, who was the former Chief of Army Staff. But I think more importantly, from our context in this today's seminar, he was the former governor of Arunachal Pradesh, a man who's actually gone. And if I know, well, I was posted in Shillong in those days. He's actually walked every part of that border and knows it like the back of his hand. We again are privileged to have Dr. Michael Van Walt, who will give us an insight into a very interesting aspect of Tibet, which is historical. And the last but not least, and I think one of the most important players in this entire Tibet issue is Sikyong, Dr. Lobsang Sangye, who will give us insights about Tibet and how he feels and what he thinks should be as part of the umbrella title that we have as Tibet in Sino Indian relations, the need for a policy reappraisal. Now, before I dive into this, into the details, I just want to give you a little brief about the FNVA's efforts in the last few years, just to give you a little context as to where we are. We have been running a series of dialogues between eminent scientists from the region, especially from India, China, and Tibet, on critical issues which have been impacting the immediate neighborhood. Some of the areas that we've covered in these regional dialogues are the Tibet plateau ecology, transboundary river waters, infrastructure development policies in Tibet and security impact on India, socioeconomic policies for Tibet and what it implies for Tibetans in India, an important topic, regional security, language, education and culture, China and Asia. Some of the landmark events that we've done over the years, we were founded in 2009. So in the space of 11 years, we've had some very interesting areas of study. In 2011, FNVA held a regional transboundary river water conference with the participation of scholars from China and the region, including Tibetan scholars in exile. It was the first time in this part of the world that an organization had both the sides, China and Tibet, discussing on issues of mutual concerns on one single platform. 2013, we brought out a paper on the reappraisal of India's Tibet policy, very well received by decision makers and policy makers in the country, and we are now looking at a reappraisal of that. In 2014, we did a conference on state of ecology on the Tibetan plateau. Other than that, a 2-year project on Tibet's relations with the Himalayas, led by Professor Siddhi Dwahik, was also undertaken, and it was done in Leh, Gangtok, and Itanagar, and it culminated in policy recommendations and a publication which is available. Without further ado, let me welcome all of you once again for this, what I think is going to be an extremely important and enlightening and insightful discussion. And as I said, I'm going to repeat myself at the cost of repetition. I would say this is the finest panel that we would get together to look into this subject. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to Gautam to take us through this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Verma. Thank you, Krishan. And of course, first of all, let me start by thanking the Foundation for Nonviolent Alternatives for not merely hosting this seminar or webinar, as the new word we have coined, but also for inviting me and my fellow panelists and the speakers for today. The topic, of course, for the day is Tibet in Sino Indian relations, need for a policy reappraisal. What I want to do at the start, before I hand over to our three very eminent speakers, is to outline what exactly is happening on our borders between India and China in Ladakh, and why a reset or a reappraisal of India's relations with China, India's policy towards China is taking place even as we speak. As all of you know, in early May of 2020, the Chinese army, the PLA, brought in huge number of troops, tens of thousands of troops, several divisions of army troops to Ladakh. And the Indian army, of course, then has since then mirrored that build-up, and the two armies now sit face to face across the tense border. The question to ask is, what exactly are the Chinese trying to do by making this move in Ladakh? What are the Chinese trying to signal? What are the Chinese trying to message by taking these military moves in Ladakh? And my answer to that, and I think a number of people in India also agree with that, is that the Chinese are trying to do this, and they're attempting to do this to send two signals. One is a tactical message, which is that they would like to move their troops, they would like to move their ground positions all the way to what in their minds is their idea of the line of actual control with India. Now, just remember that we do not agree between the two countries as to where exactly this line of actual control lies. There are several pockets where we have differences of opinion, and that a line of actual control or a boundary between two countries has to be negotiated bilaterally. In fact, what the Chinese are trying to do is they're trying to determine this line of actual control unilaterally by themselves. And in order to do that, they have brought in this huge number of troops, tens of thousands of soldiers, several divisions of soldiers into Ladakh. So this is the tactical aspect of their move. The strategic aspect of their move is to clearly show not just India, but also the whole of Asia and perhaps the rest of the world, that it is China which is the hegemon in Asia. It is China which is the number one power in Asia, and that there is a huge asymmetry in economic, military, and comprehensive national power between China and India, that India better understand this, that India better understand its place in the pecking order in Asia. And this is a message which the Chinese are trying to send not just to India, but to Asia as a whole and to the world as a whole. Now, India, of course, has responded to this by uh, moving its army, moving its troops, moving its military forces in strength. And to a certain extent, we have blocked the Chinese from achieving all of the military objectives which they may have had when they started this campaign in May of 2020. And by doing this, what we have signaled to the Chinese is that we do not agree with any of the propositions that they have, that they may have had in mind. One, that the line of actual control or even the boundary cannot be unilaterally decided, cannot be unilaterally drawn. It is a bilateral process, and India has as much of a say, and this must be done through negotiations, discussions between the two countries. We have also signaled very clearly that India does not accept the fact that China is the hegemon in Asia, that it is the number one power in Asia. And in order to uh, in order to build up, in order to support, in order to reaffirm what we have signaled militarily on the ground in Ladakh, the government of India has also taken several policy decisions to show its displeasure with Beijing, to show Beijing and China and the leadership of China that we do not accept any of these propositions. And those policy decisions are in two areas. The first, of course, is in the economic area, in the economic sphere, where India has banned several Chinese mobile phone applications or apps. And I would like to draw your attention to the fact that when India banned the Chinese app TikTok, which was one of the best known and well known apps in India, there has been a snowballing effect where other countries like the United States and even South Korea and Japan are considering taking similar steps and similar moves against TikTok. So I would argue that even through these economic measures, India has leverage over China, and such measures are absolutely correctly taken. There are other steps which the government of India has taken, which is one is that we have tightened our foreign direct investment rules so that we can have greater scrutiny, greater scanning when companies, including from China, Hong Kong, etc., invest in India. And thirdly, of course, we have already taken the step and the measure of ensuring that public procurement systems are such that Chinese companies will not be awarded contracts, even if they are the lowest cost, least cost tenderer. So these measures have already been taken. I believe that there are other measures which are in the pipeline and which will be announced and which will come down the pipeline soon. On the political side, the strengthening of India's partnerships with the United States, Japan, Australia, which is the Quad or the Quadrilateral Security Initiative, as it is called, and of course, strengthening of our partnerships with other countries in the region, including some ASEAN countries, including with Russia, is something that we will see as we move on. Through all these steps, India has clearly indicated that if there is no peace on our borders with China, then the rest of the relationship cannot continue to be as it was over the last 30 years. And in fact, India has clearly indicated that the rest of the relationship will deteriorate over time. It is deteriorating even as we speak. So, unfortunately, I can see a great deterioration in India-China relations. But this is something, this ball game has been commenced by the Chinese through their military moves in Ladakh. Now, in this whole process, obviously, India-China relations are going to be reset. They're going to be recalibrated. And there are a number of questions whether India has leverages apart from the military, economic, and political leverages that we do have. Do we have leverages where China has some sensitivities and some weaknesses. And those are the questions of Tibet, Xinjiang, and Taiwan. So I think this is the direction in which we are now moving. Does India have leverage over China where the Tibet issue is concerned, where the Tibet question is concerned? Some people in India think that India has absolutely no leverage where Tibet is concerned. I do not agree with that point of view at all. I know that whatever anyone might say, India does have leverage on China through Tibet and through the Tibet question, the Tibet issue. And as all of us who have played contract bridge will understand and will know, that I do not always need an ace of spades to make my trick. I can even make my trick with a lower card, maybe a 10 of spades. So if I have a card in my hand, I'm not going to give this up. And let us now move to the discussion that we have today. And let us ask ourselves the question about Tibet in Sino Indian relations, the need for a policy reappraisal. We have three very, very eminent and excellent speakers, but I would first like to turn to General J.J. Singh. He is going to be with us for some time, but not all of this evening. General J.J. Singh, as all of you know, and as Mr. Verma has introduced, and there is a longer introduction and a CV of General Singh, but he's a former governor of Arunachal Pradesh. He's a former Chief of Army Staff of India. Most importantly, he has written a relatively recent book titled The McMahon Line, which was released last year. And General Singh is going to be talking about from the young husband expedition to present day Tibet. General Singh, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gautam and Krishan Verma, for your introductory talks and for setting the stage for today's panel discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I consider it a great privilege to share my views on Tibet in the 20th century, its historical and geopolitical perspective with these eminent people on the panel who are experts in their fields, and the august virtual gathering of participants in India and all over the world. And I thank the FNVA for requesting me, for inviting me to come and speak to this august body. Now, we all sympathize, at least I do, with Tibet and the people of Tibet, because they have been used like a pawn in international affairs, at least from the time when the British were interested to open up with this hidden paradise or the sacred land of Tibet. It would be apt to commence my address with words of the present 14th Dalai Lama Tenzin Gyatso. He said, I quote, "When Tibet was free, we took our freedom for granted. We had little sense that if it was something we had to prove or even defend, because we were unaware that it was under threat." Unquote. Geography isolated Tibet from the world, and its history was a construct thereof. Till 1951, when the Chinese assimilated Tibet into its fold, and with brutal force when the situation called for it, Tibet witnessed either periods of independence or some form of degree of vassalage to the Chinese kingdom, depending upon the waxing and waning of the imperial China. Tibetans have been acclaimed as a race of ferocious warriors and were militarily aggressive. In fact, Tibet was an important military power in Asia till the 7th century. During brief periods in its history, it even held sway over large parts of, not large, but some parts of China, Pakistan, Mongolia, and Hindustan. It was on account of the advent and spread of Buddhism from the 5th to the 8th century that the Tibetans commenced their transformation into a Pacific society. Ancient Tibetan history is shrouded in obscurity. Tibetans believe in their mythological origin from the union of a divine male monkey reincarnation of Chenrezig, an avatar of Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, and a mother cliff ogress. Their 6 offspring were believed to be the first inhabitants of Tibet. There is some evidence to show that human settlements existed in this elevated plateau from Paleolithic times. Civilization, as the world understands it, began in Tibet with the founding of a large Tibetan empire during the reign of Songtsen Gampo, the king who was the most powerful king in the 7th century. He overran Burma and Western China and forced the Chinese emperor to a humiliating peace. As part of the terms of this peace with China in AD 640, he received a Chinese princess, Wencheng, in marriage. Reportedly, his first wife was Brikuti, a Nepalese princess. Both wives happened to be zealous Buddhists and were able to prevail upon their husband to adopt Buddhism and spread this faith throughout Tibet. In my adventures in China, when I was driving up towards Lhasa from Sining, I came across a very interesting feature that where the road bifurcates, one goes towards the Huangho Valley and one which goes to Lhasa, which is the Lhasa Gormo railway line and the pipeline. Uh, there was a huge statue of Princess Wenchang with hands folded like Namaste, welcoming any visitor who's coming into this area and going beyond. So that tells us how much the influence of Buddhism had on Tibet. And Tibetans have openly said, for us, Buddhism comes first and ideology of communism comes next. So which does not seem to gel well with the Chinese. Buddhism got established as a state religion under the subsequent kings. The new religion prevailed despite great resistance from the Bon faith, which is the ancient faith associated with the Zhangzhung culture. Buddhism, which permeated across the Himalayas, was instinctively customized by the Tibetans to suit their local conditions. This resulted in the evolution of a modified version of Buddhism, one that is deeply treasured by all Tibetans. While their spiritual needs were met from India, they looked mainly to China for their material requirements. However, as compared with their association with the Chinese, the Tibetans had a closer and special relationship with Mongolia because of Buddhism. Interestingly, a unique Choe Yon or a priest patron relationship as some kind of a security shield came into being first between the Tibetans and the Mongols in the mid 13th century, when it was established between the Sakya Guru Phagpa and the Kublai Khan, the Mughal prince, in 1254, and later between the Tibetans and the Chinese. A reformist movement in Tibetan Buddhism, the Yellow Hat sect, was founded by Tsongkhapa, a famous Buddhist teacher. This period, the 14th century, witnessed the founding of the 3 famous monasteries of Lhasa: Sera, the Wild Rose Fence; Ganden, the Joyous, located about 26 miles from Lhasa; and Drepung, the rice heap, the largest in the world, near Lhasa. Tibet's relations with China deteriorated time and again, resulting in conflicts. It's of significance that peace treaties were signed in the year 783 and 821, and they were inscribed bilingually on pillars and tablets. The AD 821 treaty has even broadly demarcated the border between China and Tibet. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is something which is very important for us to understand that between Tibet and China, the boundary was, I would say, fluctuating between the Mekong and the Salween rivers. As you know, Mekong is to the east of Salween, and east of Mekong is the Yangtze Kiang. And at one place, geographically, it's almost a miraculous way nature has made these three, four rivers, including the Irrawaddy, flow 50 kilometers apart and with mountains of 14 to 15,000 feet in between, the ranges which are also running parallel north to south. Now you can imagine the enormous difficulties for traversing this route coming from China towards the west to Lhasa. And many things come from such, I would say, geographical, geostrategic compulsions which force China to adopt an aggressive posture to annex Aksai Chin, firstly, and now also claiming Arunachal Pradesh as South Tibet. This is a new name given. It was never there before in any earlier correspondence, but therefore they also know how hollow it is. They had never been in Arunachal Pradesh, which they call South Tibet, ever. Even their ancient forebears never had entered Arunachal Pradesh, except for one or two patrols which came in the year 1911 and 12, and just to check, and then they went back because they could not stay there. The tribes were very hostile to anybody coming there. Now, I want to mention that because of these treaties, there is a boundary which, by and large, which was accepted between Tibet and China, was the mountain range between the Mekong and the Salween. That means east of this range was China and west of this range was Tibet. Yet there were many Tibetan places, Tibetan inhabited towns and villages, which were on the east of Mekong, between Mekong and Yangtze Kiang, and there were tribes which are very fierce tribes, and that's the area of Kampas. It's called the Kham, and these people were fiercely wanting to retain their independence. But still, the Chinese did manage some administrative control up to, I would say, the Mekong River and a place called Batang, which is just on the west of Mekong River. And they wanted to they would have been very happy if young husband had given them the control and powers over areas east of Salween River. And therefore, we would never have had China on our borders. And this should have been like what happened in Mongolia. The Russians were firm, but for various reasons, which I will explain, the British did not support the Tibet will be under suzerain power of the Chinese will have suzerain power over Tibet, and therefore they insisted. But Tibet could have been something like Mongolia, at least the outer Tibet. The inner Tibet, closer to the Chinese mainland, could be autonomous. But anyway, this is part of history. So, talking about Tibet, it's the tradition of Dalai Lama started with Sonam Gyatso, the third Dalai Lama, believed to be the reincarnation of the earlier two chief priests of the Gelug sect. And he was first to be formally anointed by with the title of Dalai or Tale, which is called vast as the ocean, in 1578 by the Mongolian king Altan Khan. Thus began the tradition of the Dalai Lama. The fourth one was from Mongolia. During his scholarship in Tibet, he became a disciple of Lama Lobsang Chosgyan of Tashi Lumpo. The Tashi Lama now is called the great Panchen Lama. So he was supposed to be spiritual priesthood was granted to him by the Dalai Lama, who was a Grand Lama. The Dalai Lama, the next one, the fifth Dalai Lama, Lobsang Noagang Gyatso, sorry, these names are tongue twisters, ruled for 35 years. I think he was one of the most important earlier Dalai Lamas. He united Tibet once again with the help of his patron Bushri Khan, who was a Mongol prince, and became the supreme spiritual and temporal leader of all Tibet, a combination of priest, god, and king in the 17th century. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it tells me that our Sikh founder Guru Nanak went to Lhasa also, and maybe he saw what was happening there, and this concept of tradition of Miri and Piri. Miri is the temporal head, and Piri is the spiritual head. This leadership we followed from perhaps from that example of what was being done by the Dalai Lama and what the Tibetans were accepting. Well, after this, they went into turmoil in Tibet, and because the Zungar tribe from Mongols came in 1717, and Kangxi asked for help. The Tibetan Dalai Lama asked the Chinese Emperor Kangxi for help. He sent his army, but there was a price the Tibetans had to pay for it. That after they threw away the Zungar tribe and brought peace to Tibet, they installed the next Dalai Lama as also a Chinese Amban, who represented the Manchu emperor and had vast powers at Lhasa. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Amban is the Chinese ambassador equivalent or representative of the court. And this happened, and this was the first armed intervention carried out by Chinese in Tibet. Otherwise, now what has happened in 1951 and subsequently you see how it's consolidated is the third time. But the first time it happened now, and once it happened later, which I shall briefly talk about. The powers of the Ambans and their appointees, the regents of successive Dalai Lamas, increased phenomenally after this. Now, I want to mention here, in 1727, the Chinese erected a boundary stone on the Bumla Pass to the west of Batang, which indicated that they regarded this border as more or less following the Mekong Yangtze watershed. But I said that Chinese would have been happy if we had the McMahon line had been drawn, the blue line, which I shall also talk about, between the Mekong and the Salween, because that would have given them extra area and they would have been satisfied with it, and we would never had China as our neighbor. We would have had a benign Tibet as our neighbor. And that is very important. The British were looking at their international interests and their trade and their that of the Russian or Tibet. There are these, but Tibet was, as I said, abandoned. That they want them to be autonomous. They didn't want to take the of happy, because for them there is no word as suzerainty. It is all sovereignty, and therefore they exercise this option as soon as they could. During certain phases of the 18th and 19th centuries, the machinations of the Ambans and the regents to retain their hold on power ensured that young Dalai Lamas never attained adulthood and died as minors. They were in fact murdered, but because the power wanted to be the Amban and the regent wanted to retain power in Tibet. So after the fifth Dalai Lama, you only hear of 8, 9. It's a coincidence, but it's not a coincidence because now it has been established that they were not allowed to become majors, and they were in their minority, in their young age only, they were killed or poisoned to death. The various Dalai Lamas in between. Now, a Dogra force led by General Zorawar Singh occupied up to Shigatse. No, not really Shigatse, but up to Taklakot and near Mansarovar Lake. And there they fought with the Tibetans, but the Chinese came to their aid. This is the second time when the Chinese came into Tibet, and then their army and the Tibetan army defeated General Zorawar's force. And also it was the extreme cold conditions which made it a problem for General Zorawar's army to withstand the Chinese and the Tibetans combined. So they lost. General Zorawar Singh died in this campaign, and then the Chinese advanced towards Leh, but were stopped near Chushul. And by the time reinforcements from the Sikh Darbar from Lahore, Ranjit Singh's, this was part of Ranjit Singh's empire, when they reached, they had another fight in 1841, and in which the Chinese defeated, and then they had this treaty between China, Tibet, and the Maharaja Ranjit Singh's empire. Now, what I want to add is there was some kind of a boundary demarcated by this party of Chinese officials together with the Dogras and two British officers, Captain Cunningham and Lieutenant Strachey. At that time, they signed an agreement that we will respect old boundaries. Since these are inhabited areas, the boundaries were known. People paid some revenue and taxes to which side, whether to the Maharaja of Kashmir or to the Dalai Lama. So there should be no doubt. And as rightly Gautam brought out, that it can't be done unilaterally. It has to be done with both sides sitting together and deciding how the boundary should run, what was the traditional boundary, and then take a call on that. But it can't be done unilaterally. Well, what happened after that? I should say Tibetan history and the history of this region changed after the young husband expedition. You remember, most of you have read it also. Napoleon once said, "Let the sleeping dragon lie," because when he wakes up, the world will be affected in a serious manner. He said the word tremble, but I don't think that was right. But whatever it is, he said something which was true. And young husband's expedition did precisely that. That they went in with great ease, with small fights and resistance by the Tibetan army, and reached Lhasa and got a treaty extracted from the Tibetans, which was a treaty for relations between British India and Tibet, as also Tibet and China, in which they also a large amount of money as reparation for the expedition, and the will remain with the Indian 75 years, because that's 5,000 returned in 75 years. So you can imagine what would have been the repercussions. But the government in UK, in London, decided to reduce it to 25,000 and also to be paid in 3 years. And thereafter, Chumbi Valley was given back to them, to Tibetans, and now with the Chinese. Now, I would like to say that the British Indian Empire, which was located at Calcutta, was always of the opinion that they had to ensure no outside power comes and controls Tibet. And because of their proximity to Tibet, as you know, that from the areas of Kalimpong or Darjeeling, Lhasa is 400 kilometers only, and whereas Calcutta itself is 800 kilometers. So fact is, the proximity is very important, and the British said that no other powers should be able to come and influence the Tibetans except for the British. However, the British policy, as I mentioned earlier, on Tibet swung from one extreme to the other. Sometimes it was one of non-interference or in indifference to internal affairs of Tibet, and sometimes it was to build cordial relations with Tibet in order to enhance the empire's trade and commerce. From another standpoint, British sometimes dealt with Tibet as if it was an independent entity, and sometimes as if it was a country under Chinese suzerainty. There are many factors simultaneously at play, not easily comprehended by the policy initiators in British India, but which restrained the home government in England. Now, another thing I would like to say, that there was international power play, and as I said, Tibet was sacrificed as a pawn international power play, particularly Britain's agreements on power, trade, and influence sharing with Russia, China, France, and Japan, as also the impact of events in Tibet on developments in Afghanistan, Persia, Mongolia, and Southeast Asia. These all had to be weighed and analyzed before any action could be taken on the ground. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm talking about this 20th century. I mean, it was a different scene. Today, it's a different scenario. So please, this is a good backgrounder for all of us to know that from where the whole problem started. As I believe, Tibet is the core problem between India and China and not so much the boundary. Because if Tibet is not handled well by China, they'll always look at India and blame us that we are interfering. We are not interfering in Tibet, but we can't stop the natural affinity which the Tibetans have for India. We cannot stop their ties based on Buddhism, based on culture, tradition, trade, commerce between the two countries, or between, in those days, two countries, but otherwise between the Tibet and autonomous region and India. So we are not to be blamed if they can't handle Tibet, and the Tibetans are not very happy. Even now, one gets the feedback and one sees what's happening in Tibet, as also in Uyghur province of the Chinese Turkestan, or also the inner Mongolia. These regions are not very stable as far as China is concerned. And as I said, the young husband expedition started a whole chain of events, which actually speaking woke up the Chinese dragon. Despite the tottering Manchu Empire, sent an army under a very, I would say, cruel and ferocious kind of a General Chao Feng, who was very harsh with the Tibetans, and he tried to Sinicize Tibet. And in his time, this happened after young husband's expedition returned to India. They came on their heels, and then they took a revenge on Tibetans who helped the British Indian army then, or who were not with them. So they tried to firstly destroy the monasteries. They wanted to destroy Buddhism from Tibet because they wanted to impose their own culture and traditions in Tibet. Well, the 13th Dalai Lama, Thupten Gyatso, in particular, the Tibetans were very wary of the British expansionism also, on the one hand, because they saw the British forcing themselves and acquiring Darjeeling and Kalimpong from Sikkim and Bhutan respectively. The British eviction of the intruding Tibetan army from Nathang in East Sikkim in 1888 by the use of force and British forays into Bhutan are examples where they felt that they have to be wary, and they were scared of British intervention and making Tibet a protectorate or coming and ruling over Tibet. So that also set in motion the Chinese. They came in a very big way, and in about from 1905 to 1911, they tried the best to make Tibet like any province of China, and wanted Chinese to marry with the Tibetan ladies, and they destroyed many monasteries and houses of people who were overlords over there. As also, they were able to try to make the people wear Chinese dresses, or make their hairstyle in the Chinese way, where they had a pigtail. So these are the things which they tried then, and they're trying now again after 1951. Neither did they succeed then, nor are they succeeding now, because the Tibetans have great faith in their own culture and traditions and in their Buddhist religion. I will now talk about the Tripartite Convention, which was a very important event in this period of the last 20th century. It happened in 1913 and 14 in Shimla. Initially, it was to be done in Darjeeling, but then the British realized that there are too many spies floating around of the Chinese in Calcutta and Kalimpong area, and Tibetans also who might provide information. So they shifted this venue to Shimla, and the famous Shimla Convention of 1913 and 14 took place. Now, ladies and gentlemen, in this convention, a very important thing happened. Although the Chinese plenipotentiary Ivan Chen, he initialed the document, but there were no initials. It was a full signature in English, Ivan Chen. And then there was the Tibetan plenipotentiary, potentiary, and that gentleman also signed, because in Tibetan language there is no initials, and the third was McMahon. So this treaty was signed, a convention was signed, but then a day or two later, the Chinese repudiated it, and Ivan Chen was told to convey that they don't accept it. The grounds for refusal to accept were not because the McMahon line was drawn between Tibet and Northeast India from Bhutan to Burma and beyond, the famous red line, but it was because of a blue line which started from somewhere near northern Myanmar and went up northwards, and which divided Tibet from China. This conference, if I may like to highlight, was on a three countries tripartite, each on an equal footing. That time in 1913 and 14, there were no Chinese in Tibet at all, because in after the revolution in 1911, 12, they were infighting between the royal troops and the revolutionaries, and they killed each other. The rest, the Tibetans killed, or they ran away one way or the other. Many went back from the Chumbi Valley to Kalimpong, and Calcutta went back by ship. These are things which are historical facts, that this Chumbi Valley was the easiest route to access Lhasa. So what I'm trying to say is that Tibetans took some revenge at that time, and after 1912 till 1951, they were practically an independent country. They had their own parliament called Songdu. They had their own law, and they also had their currency, the passports, etc. So therefore, Tibetans had no Chinese presence in this period of almost 4 decades. Now, what Chinese have done is that in soon as they got their independence in 49, their first objective was to come and liberate Tibet. Now, liberate Tibet from whom? Tibetans were quite happy and they were not under subjugation by anybody. So this liberation is like a word which looks nice, but in actual fact came down very heavily with a heavy hand onto the Chinese, onto the Tibetans, and made them feel that they were now under the rule of China, and yet they called it. I think the world wants Tibet to either be free or to have fully autonomous existence, where minimum interference is done by the Chinese government. And that is what the Dalai Lama has also, I think, expressed in the recent past. Well, I now come to the fact that, really speaking, you have perhaps been told about it, how the geography in Tibet happened the way it has happened, that the plate and the Indian plate crashed into each other, and the Indian plate was subsumed by the Asian plate, creating the Himalayas, creating the Kunlun, and the earth was raised, and then it was not a plateau as people think of it. There are very few areas which are like the Depsang Plains or the deserts of the Changtang area, but there are many mountain ranges which one has to traverse going up north. So I won't go into much, but to say that Tibet is 1/3 the size of America, USA, and it has many mineral resources. In fact, 40% of China's mineral resources are in Tibet, and therefore they are very interested in making sure that Tibet remains with them. As also the rivers emanate from there. You start from the north is the Huangho Yellow River, then you come to Yangtze Kiang, then you come to Mekong, Salween, Irrawaddy, and Brahmaputra. So how many rivers are emerging? And the other side on the west is the Indus River and the Satluj River. All these rivers emanate from Tibet, and therefore it has water as a major resource also, besides what I said about the minerals. Now, I would say that
General, I'm afraid it's been a long time.
yeah,
I mean, if you could wind up in a couple of minutes.
I would just try and cover the fact that Tibet was isolated, and it was isolated because uh, responsible for its isolation. And I would say the boundary dispute between India and China is has a profound effect on contemporary history and modern day evolution of the two Asian giants. Well, the genesis of the boundary problem lies in a web of complex issues, fundamental among them being the partly undemarcated, partly delimited, and at many places undefined, albeit traditionally accepted boundary that has existed for many centuries between the two great civilizations. So, with this, I would say that China has many interests, but why is the Tibet factor very, shall we say, very seriously viewed by them? One is that Dalai Lama and his Tibet administration, general administration, which is functioning from Dharamsala, has also its geostrategic location, its affinity with India, also the failure to Sinicize Tibet, and I would say the Tibetans did not readily accept the communist philosophy. Then also one very important thing is the latent anger against Chinese by the Tibetans. It's there intrinsic in them because of what happened in the past century. And then backyard is burning is a very big worry. It's an anxiety for Tibet, for China, that if something happens here, the balloon goes up. The people of Tibet are not going to be forthcoming to support them as much as the Ladakhis and the Indian population will support the Indian forces. And maybe the Tibetans would probably help us in one way or the other. So that is another worry which the Chinese have. With these words, I would like to say that India and China have to find a way to live peacefully and to develop in a manner by which the millions of underprivileged and disadvantaged people in both countries, and instead of finding a way to be a hegemon, India is no longer going to take it, and what happened earlier is history. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, General Singh. That was quite a tour de force, as they call it, of the entire subject, starting from the young husband expedition all the way down to the boundary issue between India and China. I let you speak because we were all very interested in what you were saying. But I'm afraid that there's no time for questions right away. If you permit, I think we'll move on to our second speaker so that our speakers are able to say what they would like to say. And then we can take questions at the end. Our second speaker is, of course, doesn't need any introduction. He is Dr. Michael van Walt van Praag. As all of you know, he's a professor of international law, specializing in resolution of interstate conflicts. But more importantly, as all of you know, and I'm not going into detail, his CV can be read. He is the legal advisor to His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Central Tibetan Administration. And Dr. Michael van Walt will be speaking on the need for a principled policy. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador Bambawale. Also for your opening remarks, which I think set the stage really well for anchoring this discussion in what is happening today. And I'd like to thank, as in particular, the Foundation for Non-Violent Alternatives for this Hello?
Please do go ahead, Michael. We can hear you.
All right, thank you for this invitation. And of course, in particular, Rebon Banerjee, Mr. P. Tandon, and Mr. Krishna Varma, who has been introducing a number of these panels. And after the historical overview that we have heard from General Singh, I think we're in good shape to discuss what might or what we should do today, given the situation that we're in. We are experiencing a time of multiple and potentially major changes in the world, including with respect to global power distribution and balance. And one development that is, of course, of relevance in the discussion that we're having today is the change of attitude towards China. And by that, of course, I mean the government of the PRC. And this change of attitude opens the way and perhaps even necessitates a reconsideration of our government's policies on Tibet. And I refer not only to the policies of the government of India, but of a number of other countries as well. The formulation of policies on Tibet must, in my view, be based on two pillars. They must be principled as well as grounded in an appreciation of the true nature of China's presence in Tibet, on the one hand, and they must recognize the relationship between that presence and Beijing's ambitions and behavior elsewhere in the region, on the other. So today I first would like to address the nature of China's presence in Tibet and how the international community's response to it has in fact emboldened Beijing to aggressively pursue its territorial expansionism. Next, I'll speak to the rights of the Tibetan people and the obligations of states, that is, the obligations of our governments under international law. And finally, and in light of the foregoing, I'll argue that there is an urgent need to course correct government policy on Tibet. And in discussing all of this, I wish, of course, to pay special attention to India, its relationship to Tibet, and the importance to India of course correction. China has occupied Tibet against the will of the Tibetan people now for nearly 3 generations. Its sovereignty claim to Tibet has no legal basis and rests solely on a self-serving historical narrative. This narrative, by which, among other things, the Chinese appropriate the great empires of the Mongols and the Manchus, is Sinocentric, part inaccurate, and highly misleading. But it is so persistently and forcefully pushed by Beijing that the world has gradually bought into it, and today largely treats Tibet as China's internal affair and beyond the international purview. We've become passive bystanders, in fact, to an unfolding tragedy, and as a result of our government's appeasement on Tibet, China has become an entitled bully, aggressively pursuing strategic territorial expansion elsewhere. And this is the crux of the matter. My colleague Mick Boltius and I discuss all of this in a new book called Tibet Brief 2020 that's currently in production at the publisher and will be available in November. And this book is the result of 10 years of collaborative research and explores Tibet's historical relation with its neighbors in the region, with an eye to answering the questions whether Tibet was, at any point in time, a part of China, and whether the PRC has a legitimate sovereignty claim to Tibet today. This, just for your interest, is the cover proof so that you will recognize it when it's on the market. And I hope you will read it and that you'll find it useful. Now, the Dalai Lama stated in his 5-point peace plan speech in 1987, and I quote, "The real issue is the PRC's illegal occupation of Tibet." End of quote. This is not only the root cause of the ongoing Sino-Tibetan conflict, it is in fact its very essence. Human rights abuses, cultural and religious repression, and environmental mismanagement, of course they need our urgent attention, but we should not lose sight of the fact that they are mere symptoms which will not go away until the illegitimacy of Chinese rule in Tibet is addressed. For a variety of reasons, the essence of the Sino-Tibetan conflict has mostly disappeared from the discourse on Tibet. We've started to wonder whether maybe Tibet was a part of China at some point in the past. We're entertaining the possibility that this might give the PRC the right to rule Tibet today. This is because the PRC has been successful at changing the discourse in its favor on the basis of historical claims that are difficult to assess as they require extensive research of historical source materials from centuries ago. And as a result, many people have started to doubt that it is as black and white as the Dalai Lama's characterization of illegal occupation. They're trying to make sense of Beijing's masterfully crafted historical claims that fit nicely in a Sinocentric rendition of Asian history that goes largely unchallenged. And people have difficulty finding solid evidence to prove that Beijing's claim misrepresent historical reality. And let's be clear, doubt is all that Beijing needs to maintain the status quo in Tibet. But contrary to Beijing's claim, Tibet was historically never a part of China. And this does not mean, as I've said on other occasions, that Tibet was historically always an independent state, certainly not in the modern sense of the term. To be sure, Tibet's relations with the Mongol, Manchu, and British empires entailed different forms of dependencies, but none of those relations ever entailed the incorporation of Tibet into China. I can't enter into details in the time available for me today, but my confidence on this subject comes from 10 years of solid research and engagement with about 100 scholars, starting with the rise of the Mongols under Genghis Khan 8 centuries ago, and we studied everything up to the early 20th century. Because we started with Genghis Khan because that is the period that Beijing claims Tibet first became a part of China in most of their narratives. And my colleague that I mentioned earlier, Mick Walters, and I systematically assessed all the claims the PRC makes regarding China's alleged historical sovereignty of Tibet and find that none of them hold water. In our view, and it's in the book that we are publishing, the Chinese claims are debunked. We do that one by one in the book on the basis of both historical and legal analysis. In summary, Tibet was not a part of China during the Mongol Empire and did not, in fact, become a part of the Yuan dynasty. It was not ruled by the Chinese Ming dynasty, and the Manchu Qing emperor's relations with the Dalai Lamas and Tibet never resulted in Tibet's incorporation into China. Now, these conclusions are historically accurate. They're all corroborated in contemporaneous Tibetan, Mongolian, and Chinese sources. And then, as far as the Republic of China is concerned, it claimed Tibet as part of the Republic from its inception, but was entirely unable to establish any authority in or over Tibet, leaving its unilateral claim, contradicted by the facts of Tibetan independence at the time, completely empty. So remains the question, why is this relevant today, 70 years after the Chinese army seized Tibet? Well, that Tibet is not historically part of China is important because it affects the Tibetan people's rights today. It affects the legitimacy of Chinese rule in Tibet today. It affects the obligations of the PRC under international law, and last but not least, it affects the obligations of the international community, that is, all of our governments, towards Tibet, the Tibetans, and the PRC. So being clear and speaking up about the deceitfulness of Beijing's historical narrative and the resulting baselessness of its sovereignty claim over Tibet is very important, because how the world's decision makers and influencers perceive the status of Tibet and act on that greatly affects the prospects of China's leaders being motivated to resolve the Sino-Tibetan conflict on lines acceptable to the Tibetan people. But also, China's aggressive expansionist behavior, about which we've heard already today, especially in recent years, and its bullying, accompanied by a sense of entitlement, are directly related to how the international community has treated and still treats China's invasion and occupation of Tibet, a topic I'll revert to later. So, if you thought that China's incorporation of Tibet is water under the bridge, you may want to reconsider. Let me now get to the issue of rights and obligations under international law. Tibet today is an occupied country. The PRC's presence in Tibet is illegal because its armed invasion of Tibet in 1950-51 violated one of the most fundamental norms of modern international law, the prohibition of the use of force against another state. Tibet was not a part of China when the PLA invaded it, and under international law, a state cannot acquire sovereignty over a territory seized by force or threat of force. It is, in fact, that simple. As a result, Tibetans have the right today not only to a restitution of their independence, but the entire Tibetan people has the right to exercise full self-determination under international law. I'll not dwell on the right to self-determination. We do address it in detail in Tibet Brief 2020, but I do want to state that however restrictively one interprets the scope of the right to self-determination and the peoples who are entitled to exercise it, Tibetans unquestionably possess the right to self-determination, which was in fact recognized by the international community, including India, in the UN General Assembly resolutions of number 1723 and 2079 of 1961 and 1965, respectively. And this entitles Tibetans to determine their own political status and economic and cultural development. The corollary of Tibetan rights are the obligations of the PRC under international law. All states do have such obligations. All of our governments have the duty not to recognize the illegal annexation of Tibet by China and not to cooperate or assist Beijing in any way in maintaining or consolidating its unlawful rule in Tibet, or in exploiting Tibet's natural resources, resources which under international law belong solely to the Tibetan people. This is not only a moral or political imperative, it's a legal duty. It's an obligation under international law that states are bound by. Unfortunately, many governments have violated a core rule of international law, which in fact forbids, as I just said, states from recognizing an acquisition of territory by the use of force. But India has a very special reason for not recognizing the PRC's annexation of Tibet and for not taking any actions that directly or indirectly help Beijing consolidate or legalize its position in Tibet. From a legal standpoint, India's treaty relations with Tibet are of particular importance since the conclusion of these treaties indisputably entailed recognition of Tibet's status. Recognition of Tibet's statehood, international personality, and treaty-making capacity. And I refer in particular to the Simla agreements of 1914 that General Singh spoke about a moment ago. India stated its position clearly in 1947 in a communication to the Foreign Office of Tibet, soon after Indian independence, in which it conveyed the intention to treat Tibet as it did all other countries with whom India had inherited Britain's treaty relations. And 13 years later, Delhi reminded the government of the PRC that Tibet had full treaty-making capacity in 1914, and that this had been recognized not only by Britain, but also by the Chinese government. The Indian government pointed out at the time that the three governments of Simla met on equal status. And also, it pointed out to China, to the PRC, that Tibet had treaty-making capacity, also evidenced by other valid treaties that Tibet had concluded with Nepal and Britain in the 19th and early 20th century. The well-established legal principle of estoppel prevented and still prevents India from subsequently withdrawing its recognition of Tibet's independence, because India, and before it the British, derived benefits from the three bilateral agreements concluded with Tibet at Shimla, including the cession of previously Tibetan territory to India. But legal obligations are not the only reasons governments do well to course correct their Tibet policy. Besides legal and moral imperatives, it's the international community's and in India's own best interest to effectively address the Sino-Tibetan conflict. Not doing so, and looking the other way, has emboldened Beijing to assert expanding territorial claims and influence. Beijing's reignited territorial claims in the South China Sea, in northern India and Bhutan, its exertion of undue influence in Nepal and Mongolia, as well as its violations of Hong Kong's guaranteed autonomy, and the mass incarceration of Uyghurs, cannot be treated as unrelated to the years of international appeasement of Beijing as concerns its unlawful seizure and occupation of Tibet and its implementation of oppressive policies of integration and assimilation there. Let me take the sole argument put forward by Beijing to support its claim to sovereignty of Tibet, namely the self-serving historical narrative it propagates, as a prime example for a moment. Failure to challenge Beijing on that largely fabricated version of history when it comes to Tibet makes it difficult to challenge Beijing's use of similar and related narratives to claim sovereignty over islands in the South China Sea and to Indian territory. It also results in Beijing's sense of entitlement in its relations with other countries in the regions, such as Mongolia, Nepal, Bhutan, Myanmar, Korea, Vietnam, and other countries. Returning to India, taking a principled stand consistent with international legal obligations is of critical importance. I need not remind us here of the fact that Chinese armies would not be at India's borders, just as General Singh said, and even in India's territory, if China had been prevented from invading and occupying Tibet. The so-called Indo-Chinese border does not legally exist so long as China does not lawfully possess sovereignty over Tibet. And it is not China's to negotiate about. What does legally exist is the Indo-Tibetan border, about which India has binding treaty relations with Tibet, country under Chinese occupation. The validity of the PRC's claim to parts of India, in particular to parts of Arunachal Pradesh, is directly and solely tied and dependent on the validity of Beijing's claim to sovereignty, indeed historical sovereignty, over Tibet, and of its contention that Tibet in 1914 lacked the capacity to enter into border trade and political treaties with Britain. Treaty relations that to which India succeeded in 1947. India cannot lawfully recognize that Tibet is part of China because, as you saw earlier, it is stopped from doing so due to the benefits it accrued from its treaties with Tibet, but it would also be directly harmful to India to do so. Taking the position that Tibet is legally part of China today would imply one of two things. Either that the government of India maintains that Tibet was already a part of China in 1914, at the time of the Shimla Agreements, with the inevitable consequence that this legitimizes Beijing's claim to the territory Tibet ceded to Britain and therefore to India, Shimla, or it implies that India recognizes the PRC's unlawful invasion and annexation of Tibet 70 years ago, which squarely violates international law and harms India's own position on other issues, such as Pakistan's occupation of Kashmir. It would seem to me, therefore, that it would be in India's prime interest to work with other like-minded states to bring about a course correct on the lines I'm about to propose as soon as possible. India's place is also of particular importance because other countries look carefully at India's position and policies with regard to Tibet because of its long-standing relationship with that country. And this brings me to the last part of this presentation. In order to end the occupation of Tibet and achieve a negotiated resolution of the Sino-Tibetan conflict, certain things need to be in place for which the international community's engagement is imperative. The engagement called for is entirely in line with the legal obligations and responsibilities of states. It does not constitute impermissible interference in the PRC's internal affairs, but it does require a significant course correct, because it requires that governments, one, stop from stating that Tibet is part of China or the PRC. Refraining from making such statements would be a first step to rekindle incentive for the PRC to obtain the legitimacy to rule Tibet from those who possess it, namely the Tibetans, and would bring governments of different countries in the world in compliance with international law in regard to their obligation not to recognize China's annexation. Two, refrain from stating that governments oppose or do not support independence for Tibet, which some governments have done. And this is not a position India has taken. Because not only is making such statements contrary to international law, including the Tibetans' right to self-determination, but it is not their prerogative to decide Tibet's status. Three, treat the situation in Tibet, Sino-Tibetan relations, and Sino-Tibetan conflict as falling squarely within the international communities and therefore every government's purview and responsibility, and not as China's internal affair. Four, endorse the Tibetan people's right to self-determination as called for by the UN General Assembly, and speak out against the denial by the PRC of its exercise. Five, use language. Language is important. Use language reflective of the true situation instead of adopting PRC terminology, which is widely being used now when it comes to Tibet. Tibetans must be referred to as a people and not a minority or ethnic group of China. Tibetans are not a minority, but a people under alien subjugation and domination. Adopting the PRC's minority terminology denies the Tibetan people its proper status and implicitly also its self-determination. Similarly, the use of euphemisms such as the Tibet issue to refer to the ongoing occupation of Tibet and the Sino-Tibetan conflict is unhelpful. It diminishes the seriousness of the situation and it hides the international character of the conflict as well as the international community's responsibility and obligations to address it. 6. Actively engage with both parties on re-engaging in dialogue and initiating substantive negotiations to resolve the conflict in ways that can satisfy the needs and interests of both parties. Persuade Beijing to enter into negotiations with the Tibetan leadership without preconditions, and impress upon the PRC leadership that it can only be through that process, or by means of a free and fair referendum, that the PRC can achieve the desired legitimacy and resolve its conflict with Tibet. 7. Reject the core interest trap that China has put many countries in, and with it the imposition by the PRC of rules of behavior that dictate what governments must believe, what their officials must say, who they should or should not meet, and who they should engage with. Be guided instead by facts and law, including international legal principles and norms. 8. Refrain from explicitly or implicitly endorsing the PRC's false and misleading historical narrative on Tibet, which is part of its annexation strategy. Importantly, accepting or not contesting this narrative also has, as I just discussed, repercussions beyond Tibet, since it validates Beijing's territorial claims in northern India and makes it very hard to challenge related narratives deployed by Beijing to lay claim to other territories, such as those in the South China Sea. And finally, prohibit and sanction business arrangements that aid the PRC in maintaining, strengthening, entrenching, or profiting from its presence and exercise of power in Tibet and its suppression of the Tibetan people's right to self-determination. Now, some people feel that such a course, such a change in policy is not realistic and fear retribution from Beijing. What is not realistic, in my view, is to maintain the present policy of appeasement on Tibet and believe that this will somehow encourage the PRC to negotiate with the Tibetans on genuine autonomy or to stop its repressive assimilation policies on the ground in Tibet, in Xinjiang, or East Turkestan, in Inner Mongolia, and most recently also in Hong Kong. What is also not realistic is the belief that not standing up when it comes to Tibet will cause the PRC to abandon its highly strategic territorial ambitions, whether it be in northern India, in South China Sea, or elsewhere. Let us take a cue from the Czech political leaders who have for long advocated a principled approach to China, Tibet, and Taiwan, and have taken this time of great changes today to make their move. Earlier this month, the Speaker of the Czech Parliament visited Taiwan, addressed the Taiwanese Parliament, and expressed his and the Czech people's support for Taiwan. Beijing immediately threatened punishment, but was swiftly rebuffed not only by the Czech Foreign Ministry, but by Germany and France as well. And this is surely a sign of the new times we're in. A small country and an outspoken European supporter of the PRC in the past decade has become an ardent critic of Chinese hegemony. The same politicians who were scoffed at by the Czech government for disrupting Czech-China relations out of misplaced and naive idealism are in fact today showing that they, and not the pro-Beijing politicians such as the President of the Czech Republic, are the realists and were the realists all along. They're also demonstrating that when it comes to China policy, principled policy is realist policy. What was misplaced was the belief that kowtowing to China's leaders and silencing criticism of Beijing would bring prosperity and greater independence to the Czech Republic, or would entice China to improve its behavior in Tibet and elsewhere. Besides the Czechs, Germany, France, Australia, the US, and of course India are all demonstrating a preparedness today to confront PRC bullying. This is therefore a unique opportunity to launch a new, bold, and principled Tibet policy and engage others to do the same. Such an opportunity does not come frequently, nor will it last. The time to act is therefore now. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Michael Van Walt. Amazing, very detailed 9 or 10 point, strategy policy for Tibet or on Tibet for India and other countries. Very, very interesting suggestions there. Thank you very much, Michael, for your discussion, for your talk. Let's move on since the time is short. Let's move on. Of course, all the rest of us were all just the starters or the appetizers to the main course. And the main speaker of the day, the main speaker of this evening, of course, is our third and last, but not the least of the speakers. As all of you know him, I'm not going to try to, I'm not trying to introduce him to all of you. But our last speaker is, of course, Sichung Dr. Lobsang Sangye. Without further ado, let me turn the floor and the microphone to you, Sichung, and please do address us. Thank you.
Thank you, Gautam Bambawalaji. The way you say Sichung, it sounds as though a Tibetan is saying so. So, being associated with Tibet issue, you are very familiar with the Tibetan affairs. So I know it's a great honor to be in the same platform, to be moderated by you, and to be introduced by Kishan Vermaji. Good to see you online, although, and Amita Mathurji, and I can see a lot of friends here. We all should remember that we are online, we are in the virtual or webinar mainly because of Wuhan originated virus, the pandemic that has created havoc, all over the world, geopolitically, economically, and socially, and many factors. So, which we should not forget. And great to be with the same panel with General J.J. Singh and obviously Michael Van Walt. Now, he's knighted by the government of Netherlands. So he's Sir Michael Van Walt now. So good to be associated with Knight and Chief of Staff of the Army. So great honor to be here. And thank you, Banerjee, and the Foundation for Nonviolent Alternatives for this privilege. But Bambawala, I think the appetizer was so long and so delicious. The main course has become a bit stale now. So I'll be rather brief and to the point so that we have some time for question. First, let me try to make this statement. I think recently Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said, either we change China or China will change you. I'm wearing my American influence here, not being humble, because I said in 2008, I think it's quoted in a couple of papers also, that either you transform China or China will transform you. So I said 2 years ago. And then also in 2017 on, whenever I went to European countries, I used to say, today I have not come here to save Tibet. I've come here to say, save yourself. China is no away in far away distant continent, but China is here within Europe and influencing you and changing you. Its time has come to save yourself. So today, also on this panel, even though the topic that I'm given is a need for a policy reappraisal, a Tibetan perspective, I think I've come to say, India should save itself, given the reality. Because if you go by history, I think all the prime ministers of India, except for Lal Bahadur Shastri, chose cooperation with China, thinking they'll get some dividends over competition with China. It was Lal Bahadur Shastri who said, I want to recognize Tibetan government exile. I want to do various things for Tibet, but it was short-lived. So he wanted to confront China, but he didn't live long. So that policy never materialized. But all the prime ministers since then and before chose cooperation, and now there's nothing or bare minimum to show for all the cooperation extended by the various leaders of the government of India. So I think the lesson is very clear. You trust in China, you hope they will reward you for your good behavior. It's not happening. Now, Washington has also changed from cooperation to competition. European countries are also changing from cooperation to competition, and Japan and Australia and other countries. So it's time for India to choose competition over cooperation. And we have been saying, based on our experience, you should verify, then only trust what the Chinese government say and do. So that's one thing. And number two, I think the countries around the world are also looking at Asia to choose a model, Indian model or the Chinese model. Development with democracy or development without democracy, the Chinese model. And Chinese government and Chinese leader Xi Jinping himself has said, socialism with Chinese characteristic essentially means development without democracy. So this is spiritual ideological conflict. And India is definitely a role model for Asia and for the larger world as well. So India should embrace other democracies and form alliances. There are alliances, just yesterday, a major NGO issued a report on Tibet saying there are labor camps in Tibet like Xinjiang. Now, 63 parliamentarians of Alliance for Democracies on China, they have come out with a statement today. 63 members of parliament from different countries have condemned these labor camps in Tibet. There is alliance of democracies, of members of parliament, and there are alliances formed of democracies. I think India should proudly not just participate, should lead the effort, because India is a major successful example of democracy with development, with democracy. So I would like to suggest that. And also, Indian government or India can allow representatives or experts at various United Nation forums, including Human Rights Council, to speak their mind on Tibet issue, because there are human rights violations going on in Tibet. But even the experts and what do you call the special representatives in various United Nation forums, they either absent themselves or don't speak even sometime to the Chinese government line on issues like Tibet and Hong Kong and Xinjiang. I think time has come for to allow the independent experts and special rapporteurs in human rights and other issues on environmental matters to speak their mind objectively as an expert on Tibet issues. So we always try to raise the issue of Tibet at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and often we find Indian experts, even though they're very friendly, very cordial in private, but in the public forum, they tend to shy away. So I think these are the things government of India can do. And also, I think His Holiness Dalai Lama wrote to Rajiv Gandhi in 1986, in which he said, well, for various reasons, India recognized Tibet as part of China, but he says that in 1986, now that the conditions under which the government of India recognized Tibet as being part of China have completely changed and are non-existent, I feel that it would be appropriate for the government of India to adopt a new policy in accordance with the changed circumstances. Now, definitely, at that time, there were changes in circumstances. Now, after Doklam and Galwan Valley, tragic incidents, time has come for government of India to say Tibet, China says, is a core issue for them. For many reasons, Tibet is a core issue for India, and hence put it on the table and discuss the issue. I think that has come. And also, in 1965, Tibet Swaraj Committee, it was held at India International Center on October 1965. They said that India should recognize the government exile, that India should sponsor the Tibetan issue at the United Nations, that India, with the help of Tibetans in exile, should launch a cultural offensive against China's occupied Tibet. So this were the suggestions by Indian friends or Indians in 1965. And His Holiness Dalai Lama wrote to Prime Minister of India in 1986. I think all this needs to be put on the table and, review the policy of on Tibet. Now, having said that, I must acknowledge, and we say this repeatedly and proudly, and we really meant it, that is, no government or country has done more for Tibetan people. Indian government and Indian people have been the most generous, most supportive of the Tibetan people. But given the recent experience, I think, we all should wake up and look at China realistically and have also a more robust policy on the issue of Tibet. Now, then there are other things one can do. And again, in 1986, His Holiness wrote to Prime Minister saying Buddhism is an important part of the great culture of India, and it is a fact that Tibetan Buddhism and culture that evolved around and originated from Indian should have a major role. So it's time, His Holiness always talks about reviving Nalanda tradition in India. And time has come for the people of India to embrace His Holiness' fourth commitment to revive Nalanda tradition in India. Because if you look back, for around 1,000 years, from 2nd century to 12th century, India was number one in the world on a spiritual matter, on values, on civilization, even commercial matters, right? And at that time, Buddhism was prevalent. I think, by exporting one or two scholars of Nalanda to various countries around the world, Buddhism has spread all over the world. I would argue that, now the government of India talks about Make in India. The original Make in India or Made in India was Nalanda University, and it was exported without GST charges. And the dividends keep coming even now after 2,000 years, right? India has respect from all these countries, saying this is the land of Buddha, and we got Buddhism from this country. And the respect that they have for India is because of Nalanda University and Nalanda tradition. And His Holiness wants to revive Nalanda tradition in India. And a small matter, but important, during the Doklam incident, there were so many experts on Indian national television talking about Doklam, but there was some confusion, a minor, but it reveals something important. That is, what is the term Doklam? So in Tibetan, Doklam means the nomad's road. Thoklam means a difficult road. Dolam means a road, right? Now everybody says Doklam without understanding, is it a nomadic road or difficult road or a road that they're talking about, right? Because even though there were a lot of experts talking about great things, major issues, but they didn't completely understand the term Doklam, which means the Tibetan studies, understanding and education about Tibet is lagging in all the major universities of India. If you go to America, Harvard, Berkeley, Virginia, Columbia, all have Tibetan studies program and all have full professorship on Tibetan studies, whereas in India you don't. You go to Oxford or you go to Cambridge or Germany, Tibetan studies program and Tibetan Buddhist program or Nalanda program are available in major universities and Ivy Leagues, America and Europe. But in India, there's very, very few programs like that. So its time has come to have Nalanda tradition studies and Tibetan studies in various universities in India, so that the younger generation of the Indian population will be educated about Tibet. Otherwise, I often say this, when, during the Galwan tragedy, I appeared in a couple of media, and they always ask me, why are the Chinese troops are at the border? And I said, because you say it's Indo-China border, the Chinese troops are saying, because you say it's China's border, we are at our border. Now the dispute is over, 1 acre of land or 1 kilometer here or 1 kilometer there, whereas you have already conceded 2.5 million square kilometers of land, 2/3 the size of India or 1/3 the size of America, as General J.J. Singh said. You have already said Tibet is part of China. And you have already said it's Indo-China border. They will come to the border because they say, you say Tibet is part of China. Here we are in Tibet. You say it's China's border. We are at the border. And then the issue was also raised about the 1947 telegram sent by government of Tibet to Pandit Nehru, about the border issue. And then I was asked this question too, what do you say, what do you have to say about this telegram? And this is the legitimacy or validity that the Chinese army is using to come to the border. And I said, look, in 1914, we signed an agreement called Simla Convention and McMahon Line as the border. There is a written document signed by the Tibetan Prime Minister, is given to India, and that is the demarcated border. The Indian government, for the last 60 years, is not recognizing that document. But then now you raise this telegram. As a telegram is a telegram. You are not even recognizing the written document signed by Tibetan Prime Minister saying, yes, Tawang is part of India. Officially, it's not recognized. Then you say, raise the telegram. I said, first, we have already given to you in writing, accept that. So hence, time has come to say, we must go back to all these issues, because in 1956, when His Holiness Dalai Lama came to India, he spent a couple of months, but he was persuaded by the Indian government then to return with the hope that everything will be done peacefully and autonomy of the Tibetan people will be respected and granted. But that did not materialize. Hence, government of India has a major say on the Tibet issue, because in 1956, the Chinese government, Zhou Enlai, visited 3 times and assured the government of India that autonomy will be granted to Tibetans and there will be no violence. Everything will be through consultation and peaceful means. That was not implemented. And all the prime ministers, I think most of the prime ministers who went to China, they did raise the issue of Tibet, including Rajiv Gandhi and others. They all were assured many things, but not implemented. Hence, time has come, I think, to review the policies, past policies and past mistakes, and come out with more robust stand on the issue of Tibet. And finally, there is a great talk by even a written petition by 200 members of Parliament to grant Bharat Ratna to His Holiness, and also. Former Foreign Secretary Niruppama Rao also mentioned it. So a lot of people have retweeted and supported this. I think this is the true sentiments of the Indian people. That much respect the people of India has towards His Holiness Dalai Lama. So I think this also should be taken into consideration, because as you know, His Holiness has been awarded all the major awards in this world, except for one from the government of India. Of course, he loves India. He calls himself proud son of India. He is, I think, one of the best ambassadors that India can have. But I recall this incident when His Holiness was meeting with President Barack Obama in the 45-50 minutes, the first 20 minutes, he was talking about India and India and India. So people close to him was thinking in their mind when he is going to speak about Tibet. So that shows that his love for India, the Indian culture, Indian civilization is so great, right? He calls himself proud son of India. So I think the proud son of India needs a bit of recognition. Now, with or without any award, I think His Holiness the Lama for us is the greatest leader. But with it, I think it will be, acknowledgement of the, larger sentiments of the Indian people and love for India by the Tibetan people. So with that, I want to end my presentation and, wait and look forward to questions from the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sichung. A very thought-provoking presentation, a very thought-provoking speech. Let's now open it out to questions. I think there must be questions from the floor. While all of you are putting your thinking caps on, and please do put your questions on the chat box, and then I'll recognize you and request you to ask the question. So while you're doing that and while you're thinking up your questions, let me ask all three panelists my first question, which is addressed to all three of you. Maybe we can go in the order of the speakers. General J.J. Singh is back. Dr. Van Walt is with us, and Sichung, of course, is with us. But recently, this information came out that the Special Frontier Force was also part of the action which is taking place, the military action which is taking place in Ladakh. So my question is, what is your reaction to this information becoming public? How do you see it? How do you react to it? What are your thoughts on it? General JJ, if you could start first, and then I'll request Dr. Van Walt, and then finally Dr. Sangay.
Gautam, as I mentioned to you, that I also covered in my talk, the backyard is burning kind of anxiety which the Chinese have will get further accentuated because these are all, shall we say, the progeny of people who came in 1959 along with the Dalai Lama or thereafter who escaped from Tibet to avoid persecution or to avoid harassment and being put into jail. Now, these are the children of those, and I was in Arunachal Pradesh, firstly as a commanding officer in 1981-82, and I saw this camp of theirs where they were being trained. Now, this is the second generation of those same people which I saw as a governor in Arunachal Pradesh. If they are taking part in these operations, they are taking part in these operations because they have the skills. They also have the aptitude to function in mountains and high altitudes. So now it will certainly create a feeling of insecurity to the Chinese that Indian Army is going to give them a befitting reply in case they do any misadventure. And we have, amongst others, they are also there. Not that without them, we wouldn't be able to do the task given to us, but this is ensuring that we have an overwhelming superiority at the point we choose. And they are son of the soil in the sense for them entering into anything which is Tibet would be even a matter of great honor. And the people of Ladakh will be very happy because basically Ladakh is called Little Tibet. And then they are also very much there's an affinity because of religion, and sentimentally also all Ladakhis are going to support us, as I said earlier, and the Special Frontier Forces taking part in this. Well, it was not a secret. Everybody knows about it that there is an organization like that. It was in the news once in a while, and the Chinese are aware of it. So to use them, I think, is a wise step, and they will pay rich dividends in action.
Thank you. Dr. Van Walt, would you like to comment?
Well, thank you. Yes, I also don't necessarily think there's a problem in it being being known publicly. I don't think it was such a well-hidden secret. But I think that it raises one question relating to some of the things I said, and that is the difference between the Tibetan, the Sino-Tibetan conflict being addressed in a principled manner, and the danger, on the other hand, of Tibet being used as a card for political objectives by other countries. And I'm not just speaking about India, but other countries have done that in the past, the United States, Britain, etc. Tibet has a history of having been used when it was convenient for others to use it. And I think Tibetans need to be aware of the danger of that. At the same time, when opportunities arise, as they are arising now, it is important to take those opportunities. So a good balance between using opportunities, but convincing the governments that are willing to work with Tibetans that this should be on the basis of a principled approach, as opposed to only an opportunistic approach, I think is key.
Thank you. That was very interesting. Thank you, Dr. Van Walt. Sichung, would you like to react or respond to that question?
Normally, we don't comment on these issues. I hope you understand.
Okay. Then, in that case, there is a question in the chat box. So let me go to that question. I'm afraid I don't know who had asked it, but you spoke about moving from cooperation to competition, not only for India, but for other countries too, but particularly for India. Now, the question is that should this be done openly, or should it be done quietly or by stealth? Because, if it's done openly, there would be costs incurred and costs involved in taking such steps and in taking such measures and in undertaking such a policy. So what is your reaction to that?
I think you get this argument, the cost, the economic cost one has to pay. This is the argument that Washington, D.C., talked about for so long. But actually, China is the manufacturer. They are the one who are selling things. And you are the buyer. The customer is the king, right? Normally. So all the things that they manufacture, the American and European market bought, and China enriched themselves. So in fact, you are the market and you have a leverage. That's number one. But number two is, yes, there are certain things you can do quietly behind the scene, and there are certain things you should do publicly. For example, it's been 20 plus years. The sinologist, China expert, used to say that if you do anything publicly against China, Chinese leaders, they will lose face. Losing face is such a big thing in Chinese culture, so you should not make them lose face. If they lose face, they won't do anything. So let's take this human rights discourse from a public discourse, where the statements were issued by the foreign ministries and the parliamentarians and the governments and the reports issued by the government, to a bilateral, closed-door meetings. But after 20 plus years of bilateral closed-door meetings, the result is human rights situation in Tibet has gone from bad to worse. Human rights situation in China has gone from bad to worse. Human rights situation in Hong Kong has gone to bad from worse. So sometimes you need to do quietly, sometimes you need to do publicly. Anyone who says that, and if you do publicly, you will pay a price, I think, if there's a coordinated effort, the Chinese will listen. Hence, yes, there are certain things you need to do publicly as well.
Thank you. That was very well put. There's a question in the chat box from Dundup Gyalpo, but he is asking me to ask the question on his behalf. And the question is as follows. I think let's address it to all three of the speakers. Let's go in the reverse direction this time, starting with Sichung first, Dr. Van Walt second, and General J.J. Singh third. But the question is, if we could look beyond the current standoff at the Indo-Tibetan border between Indian and Chinese forces, Dhundup Gyalpo would like to ask whether, in the view of our panelists, the government of India needs to be well prepared for a post-14th Dalai Lama era. And if the answer is yes, then how should it prepare? In what aspects? What respect should it prepare? So let me pose this question on behalf of Dhundup Gyalpo to all three of you. We start with Sichung first and go in the reverse order as compared to the previous question.
You know, I am a Tibetan and a follower of His Holiness Dalai Lama. So he himself has said that he's going to live more than 100 plus years, so 113 exact. So we still have more than 2 decades, rather, in a quarter of century, before that arrives. So before that, I think all the Chinese leaders that we see will not be in. So he has outlived all the Chinese leaders, and he will outlive them too. So we have quarter of century. So there is no rush to reach that stage. Having said that, yes, in November of last year, we have convened 2 meetings of the Tibetan leaders from around the world, secular leaders and religious leaders from around the world, where we have concluded and said reincarnation is Tibetan business. We invented the concept and practice of reincarnation. We have complete copyright and patent over reincarnation. Yes, Chinese factories are good at manufacturing or making duplicates, but duplicates are duplicates, originals are originals. So we are the original owner of reincarnation, number one. Number two, it's a matter of religious freedom. And number three, Communist Party should not interfere. Now, His Holiness jokingly said, and he has a point, if Communist Party of China is so interested in reincarnation of his reincarnation, then they first find a reincarnation of Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping and Zhu He, So they must show their skill, because we have been doing it for more than 1,000 years, right? We have legitimacy and validity. So yes, we have done that, and then and positively, the American government have issued various statements supporting that the reincarnation should be determined by His Holiness Dalai Lama himself and no one else, and should be determined by the Tibetan Buddhist leaders. And many European countries have also supported that. And perhaps India could also say, we will not interfere in the reincarnation of Dalai Lama. It's his own business. And that statement can be made, right? So yes, we all are aware of these things, but His Holiness Dalai Lama will be with us for a long time to come. But Indian government can do extent a statement saying we believe, because Indian government does not interfere in any of the Shankaracharyas or any of the religious leaders' affairs, and this is a universal practice and principle of India not to interfere in religious matters, and the reincarnation of Dalai Lama is solely the business of Dalai Lama.
Thank you. I think one of the points which you didn't mention and have left unsaid, but I think which comes through loud and clear, is that if His Holiness the Dalai Lama still has a quarter century to be with all of us, to live on this world, on this earth, then all of us should make full utilization and full use of this time in whatever manner is most productive. I guess that's an important thing which you hinted at, but which you left unsaid. Could I turn to Dr. Van Walt and ask you, Dr. Michael Van Walt, whether you would like to respond to that question? You need to unmute yourself, sir. Yes.
Yes,
We can now hear you.
There's a little delay in the unmuting, so it. I fully endorse what Sikyong Lobsang Sangye just said. But in addition, I would just like to make the point that clearly the Tibetan issue, the Tibet cause, is not all about and only about His Holiness the Dalai Lama, as the Chinese would like to have that presented. As you know, every time the Chinese say the negotiations or discussions can only be about the Dalai Lama's private and his family and his return to the Great Motherland and so on, trying to reduce the issue from a conflict between two states, between a people and a government, to a dispute between an individual, even of the stature of His Holiness, and the Chinese government. So I think what India should do is move to ensure that it frames its policy on Tibet appropriately as an issue, as a political, as a strategic, as a military issue, as a legal issue, so that it becomes very clear that the problem is not going to go away whether or not His Holiness is actively involved or not. Again, a principled policy will ensure that it isn't dependent on His Holiness.
Thank you. General J.J. Singh, there's a question for you which I'd like to read out. It's from Mr. Bhaskar Koirala in Nepal. And his question is as follows, is addressed to you, General Singh. Given the great tensions in the international environment at the present time, particularly between the great powers, I guess that is the US and China, I've lost the question. Okay, here it is. Sorry. So given the tension between the great powers, given the rather precarious location in which Nepal is situated, if you were a Nepali leader, what would be your course of action at this point of time? And in two respects, one is as far as the Sino-Indian relationship is concerned, and secondly, from the aspect of the concerns of the Tibet issue. So what is your reaction and your response to that, General?
Gautam, may I say something about the first question?
Yes,
because
please do. Please go ahead. Yes,
in
of course.
Arunachal
Please.
and studying their history,
Absolutely.
the 13th Dalai Lama, Thupten Gyatso, when he ran away from Lhasa because he was afraid the British Young Husband expedition, beg your pardon, sorry, is going to probably catch him and then ask him for accountability. And therefore, he went to Mongolia. But after that, in his absence, when the Chinese came into Lhasa, and later on, when he went for the second exile into India this time, because the Chinese came looking for him at the palace, and he came to India. Now, when these two exiles happened, the Chinese put up posters in Lhasa on the walls of houses denouncing the Dalai Lama. And you will not believe that these posters were defaced with cow dung and yak dung by the people, because they said, we don't believe it. We have our own sentiments and feelings for the Dalai Lama. And therefore, the present Dalai Lama also is revered. Whatever happens for the future is best left to the traditions and cultures which Dr. Sangye mentioned, and therefore it's a Tibetan matter. I would also mention to you that where Tawang comes into this picture, Tawang is a Buddhist area in Arunachal Pradesh, and most of them have come from eastern Bhutan. And otherwise, they have also, some may have come from Tibet also. But the fact is that in that area, the sixth Dalai Lama was found as per the Buddhist tradition, as per the tradition of the Dalai Lama's selection process. It's very intricate but very interesting. So therefore, when the oracles say something, if it happens in Tawang area, like they have the monastery there and the sixth Dalai Lama's precedent exists, Chinese want to take Tawang. India said, sorry, Tawang is a settled population, it's a settled matter, and in the McMahon line, it is clearly on our side of the McMahon line, and Sona Zong is on the Chinese side, so or Tibetan side. So this is the background I wanted to emphasize on. Second point now, what you said, Nepal. I think Nepal has got a very difficult situation. They have to do, tightrope walking between two giants, and they generally are saying that when two elephants fight, the grass gets destroyed or trodden upon badly, mauled. So I think Nepal should remain neutral, and Nepal should not interfere with either Indian or Chinese or. I think the best thing for Nepal is to be neutral in this case and continue to follow a policy where they will not be looked at by one side or the other, because they have to survive here. They have to survive in this scenario where there are two giants who are at the moment having very tense relationship. But I'm saying maybe wisdom will prevail, good sense will prevail, and the leadership will go across the boundary dispute, and there'll be peace and tranquility.
Thank you, General. There's a very interesting question from Bhavna Singh, and it's maybe I'll direct it to the Sichung. How has the state's response to COVID in Tibet been, and are local Tibetans happy with that effort? How is the nature of state intervention during this period? Has the local leadership managed to win hearts and minds in Tibet? Could I address this to you, Sichung? You'll have to unmute yourself, Sichung. We are not able to hear you. Please unmute. Thank you.
When the same state said that Tibet was peacefully liberated, Tibetans welcomed the Chinese army to Tibet. What can you believe? Whatever they say on the issue of Tibet, including the pandemic, I think we had one data till March 18th, where it's very unique, where it's very interesting. They said 106 Tibetans were infected, all got cured, and no one died. Now, we know for a fact that just from one county, a dozen Tibetans died. But in their official report, 106 infected, no one died. So after March 18th, no information whatsoever. So obviously, later we learned that the whole pandemic happened because they released the information, or they shared the information, including with WHO, by 3 weeks or 6 weeks delay. And according to some expert, a major international organization said, had the Chinese government released the information early and being transparent, could have prevented 95% of the pandemic, right? So they withheld information, and especially on Tibet, they will withhold more of those information. So that's the case. And obviously, they try to portray that they have provided all the healthcare necessary, and Tibetans are taken care of. That has been their stand, but it's very difficult to believe.
The next question is directed at Dr. Michael Van Walt, and the question is, what is preventing world governments, including, of course, the government of India, to recognize Tibet as an occupied country? That is addressed to you, Dr. Van Walt.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for the question. It's a good question. What is preventing? Fear, I think. Fear of retribution on the one hand, and I think to some extent well-founded fear, because the Chinese government has shown that it is willing to punish governments for not complying with what it wants in different occasions, but to some extent also unfounded, because it's very clear that those countries that have been the most forceful or clear about their positions have suffered the least. You can see it with countries that have taken a stand on meeting with His Holiness. With the US, it's very clear. There has simply been a consistent policy on the US side of meeting with His Holiness when he is in the United States by the President. That has not caused hardship to the US or harm in its relations with China. It is where there is an insecurity and a weakness in the position of a government that China will take the advantage and punish the hardest. That's one aspect, I think, is the fear. The other is simply an unwillingness to depart from previous policy. When you speak with European governments, for example, you find very quickly that the Europeans will say, well, this is a EU policy. And when you talk to the EU, they say, this is a policy of the governments of the European countries. In other words, everybody likes to respond to the question on recognition of Tibet simply by saying, others are doing it, and therefore we are not exceptional. We're just doing what the rest of the world's doing, or we're doing what the rest of Europe is doing. Instead of, again, taking a principled position based on the reality of the nature of China's presence in Tibet. Based for Britain, for example, it should be based on their own treaty relations and their own past record with Tibet. And my hope is that this will change, but it can only change if there is a sufficient number of governments, and it can be 3 or 4, but there has to be more than one that jointly realize that the time is ripe to make a change in policy. And that change in policy does not necessarily have to be an immediate recognition of the Tibetan government in exile or an immediate recognition of Tibet as an occupied country in an express way. It can be a cessation, an end to this constant repetition of the mantra that the Chinese government wants everybody to repeat, which is Tibet is part of China, Tibet is part of China. At every occasion that the Chinese government asks another government to do, when there's a summit between 2 leaders, when at other occasions they wish the other governments to repeat this mantra. The first step is to stop complying. There is no reason to make that statement. I don't know of other examples where countries are being pressured to constantly repeat that some territory is part of another country. It is only China that requires this. This should stop as a first step. Second step is to raise the level and nature of relations, government-to-government relations between various governments and the Tibetan government in exile. As a factual matter, without necessarily changing the protocol of it, but intensifying those relations and raising the level of it. And the third stage, in my view, should be one of a more explicit recognition of Tibet's status as an occupied country, which, as you know, the US Congress has recognized in the past, and the European Parliament has recognized in the past. There is no reason not to reaffirm that simply. And other countries and other parliaments hopefully will reaffirm that as well, so that we don't forget what this is all about, so that we are reminded an occupation, as you know, in international law, is a temporary situation. It cannot become permanent. And therefore, as long as we recognize Tibet as an occupied country, it becomes very clear to everybody that this is a conflict that needs resolution. And that, I think, is important for us to remember.
Thank you. There's a question from Gunther Kalona, and I think I'll take that because it seems to be directed in my direction, describing China's moves in India's neighborhood, especially in South Asia. His question is, what is India doing to fend off these moves by China to move in ever closer to India? So I think, Gunther, I think the answer to that is that, India has been working with its neighbors in South Asia, apart from Pakistan, of course. But with all the other neighboring countries, we have been doing a lot, whether it's economically or politically or even socially and culturally. We are not going to compete with China. It's not going to be dollar for dollar competition with China, because we know that that will not be something which we can win, given the size of China's economy today and India's economy today. But we have certain leverages, we have certain advantages which the Chinese don't have. For example, there are historical, cultural, familial, family to family ties between people in India and people in all these other countries. There are certain other areas where India has a competitive advantage, like in training of personnel, in developing your human resources, etc. And we do a lot of that with our neighboring countries, and we will continue to do that. And I think even if at present it looks as if China is making some heavy moves into India's neighborhood, I'm quite convinced that I think India will come out of this kind of competition ahead of anyone else. So I hope I've been able to answer that question. The next question, of course, is addressed to the Sichung, of course. It's from Tashi, and he says, or she says, that you mentioned the problem of the lack of Tibet studies at Indian universities. And the question is, during your period as Sichung, how have you contributed? What have you done? What measures or steps have you taken to ensure that Tibet studies are undertaken at Indian universities? The floor is yours, Sichung.
Yes. Number one, we established a Tibet Policy Institute here in Dharamsala. So we have all the MPhil and doctorate degree holders. Some of them come here and then network with other think tanks and universities all over India, and then have partnership, joint conferences, sponsorship, things like that. And then, yes, I've been to various universities myself and given series of talks and urging them the importance of Tibetan studies and Tibetan programs. So yes, it's an ongoing effort. And then the Tibet Policy Institute have also reached out to many think tanks and research centers all over the world, including in Europe and America. So that's what they have done. And also, for example, in JNU and other universities, we try to have, a Tibet day. On that day, we invite experts to come and share their views on Tibet. So these are the things we have done, and just to summarize what we have made efforts so far.
Thank you. Maybe we'll take with this last question, because we are really now beginning to run out of time. We've been on for a long time. This is also addressed to the Sichung, and it is from Ambassador Suresh K. Goel. Are there any re-education / concentration camps in Tibet, as is the case in Xinjiang?
Yes, a report just came out today, and a major international organization have come out with a report saying there are major and many labor camps in Tibet which are similar to Xinjiang. So if you go to our website, tibet.net, kindly read the report. And 63 members of parliament from different parts of the world, mainly democracies, have also issued a statement condemning the human rights violation in Tibet and seeking investigation on the issue. And also, we all should know that the party secretary of Xinjiang, the architect of labor camps or the concentration camps in Xinjiang, was the party secretary of Tibet before, or the Tibet Autonomous Region. So he implemented over his 5 years term in Tibet, and then the algorithm, the grid system, the technological surveillance, the all this neighborhood watch, and the labor camp or the concentration camp were implemented in Xinjiang. And if you go back even to 1960s, the earliest Gulag, as Harry Wu, the former political prisoner who was a democracy activist, used to say, the labor camp was established in Tibet, and Harry Wu was sent to Qinghai Gulag or labor camp in Qinghai. He spent many years there. So he himself, testified saying, there were gulags in Tibet and the early ones, and he was one of the prisoners. So yes, there were always labor camps or gulags in Tibet and continues to do so even now.
I would like to just add that retired Colonel Vinayak Bhatt has given the link, and we'll share it with all of you, about the Tibet gulags. It's a piece that he has written in the print.in, and we'll share this with all of you. Thank you so much, Colonel Vinayak Bhatt. Let me also, since we are running out of time, let me bring this discussion to a close. Thank you so much for all your very interesting questions. I want to hand the floor back to Mr. Krishan Verma.
Thank you, Gautam, for conducting I think, a most enlightening, most encouraging, and most invigorating talk from three very, very fine personalities, and of course, you yourself, who actually covered this and gave a wonderful overview. Just a couple of remarks before I actually put this to an end. One was about, there was a question about the neighborhood. I think the neighborhood will very soon realize that friendship with China comes at a cost. It's an economic cost, and they grab land in place of that. And I think they must begin to understand. We are seeing what's happened in Nepal. We are seeing what's happened in Bhutan. We are also going to see things happening in other countries in the region. So I think people are mindful, and I think they are small countries, but they are proud countries. They are nationalists in their own right. And I think they will understand that they are not up for sale. The other point, I think, very, very well articulated by Dr. Michael von Walt, I think, beautifully sort of point-wise analysis of what we should be doing as part of the principal policy. I haven't heard this in a long time. So cogent, so succinct, and absolutely penetrative. I think we should take this on board and try and flesh this out further as we go along. As I was mentioning in my introductory remarks, we've tried to carefully curate this whole program. We've had these 5 sessions now. I have tried to take it from, with the help of my other colleagues, to take it from China's expansionism right through Tibet. And we now, in the next couple of sessions, we'll be looking at some more aspects of that, including Buddhism, the religion part of it in the Himalayas. And then going on to subjects like Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, we'll probably go to Hong Kong, look at Taiwan. So the whole idea is to give our audience, and I find some great experts in there, gives us courage to go forward with these webinars. That we need to understand China in a much more different way. Gautam, you used a very nice phrase initially about the ace of spades, and China seems to be holding that. I really wanted to say that sometimes a 2 of clubs also finishes an ace of spades. It's how you play it. I think we have the deck of cards. I think it's represented by democracies. There's a great panoply of options that we have. We play it right, and the democracies get together. I think we can finish that so-called ace of spades that they hold, or they pretend that they hold. Let me not keep you further from this. It's been a long session. Let me thank each and every one of you, the audience, for being here, to each of the panelists, and Gautam, you for chairing it. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to learn and more about Tibet, which is so dear to our hearts. I have been associated with it for a very long time, as many of you would know, and have done some very interesting expeditions there. We will share sometimes in one of our talks as we go along, including having gone to some of the dreaded areas of what Sichong referred to as gulags. I have actually been to one of them. So we know what it's all about. I think we will, as we go along in the next series of webinars, we'll probably be elaborating on some of these visits. Thank you very much, all of you, for being here, and look forward to seeing you again. We'll be putting out notices about our next webinar and the subject of that. Please do attend. We look forward to your presence there. Thank you very much, Gautam. Thank you very much, General. Thank you very much, Professor Mold. Thank you, Sichong. Good night.